Greetings, seekers of mysteries, and welcome back to Mystic Legends. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I have a little request. Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. And if you enjoy these journeys into the unknown, don't forget to support us with a like and a subscription. Who knows, maybe in the next story, you'll hear something that hits a little too close to home. Now, let's settle in and wrap ourselves in the eternal blanket of night as we venture into the realm of shadows. Tonight's story is about forgotten souls who have yet to find peace. They say that sometimes when the night is silent and the wind doesn't whisper, you might hear someone tapping at your window, even though no one is there. Close your eyes and feel the chill of the ghostly world, always closer than we imagine. Are you ready to face what waits beyond the veil? Then let's begin. I wasn't always afraid of playgrounds. In fact, as a kid, I loved them. But now, every time I see one, it sends shivers down my spine, especially if there's a swing set. I used to live in a quiet neighborhood in Omaha, Nebraska. It was your typical suburban area, all neat lawns and friendly neighbors. The kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen, at least. That's what I thought before we moved to 722. We moved into the house when I was 12. It was an older home, but spacious and comfortable, with a big backyard that led directly to the local park. It was perfect for a family with kids. My younger sister, Ellie, loved the idea of having a playground right in our backyard. Every afternoon after school, she would beg to go play on the swings or slide down the rusted old slide. I never minded taking her. It was just a part of our new routine. That playground was old, though. I remember the first time I saw it up close. Something about it made me uneasy. The swings creaked even when the wind wasn't blowing, and the merry-go-round spun just a little too fast for comfort, as if someone had just pushed it. But I never said anything. I didn't want to freak Ellie out, and I figured it was just me being a paranoid older brother. Then Ellie started talking about her. She never gave her a name, just a girl. At first it sounded innocent enough. "The girl likes to push me on the swings," she'd say, or "the girl wants me to come play on the slide." My parents thought it was cute. They figured it was an imaginary friend, something normal for a 5-year-old to invent after moving to a new place. But I noticed something. Every time Ellie talked about the girl, she would look toward the playground at the far end of the park, the part of it that no one ever used. There was a second playground tucked behind a line of trees, one I hadn't noticed until Ellie pointed it out. It was older than the one closer to our yard, with overgrown grass and broken equipment. No one ever played there. That part of the park had been abandoned for years, and I soon found out why. It was late October when things started to get strange. The days were getting shorter, and it was already getting dark by the time we got home from school. Ellie had her usual request. She wanted to go to the playground. My parents were busy with work, so I took her, despite the growing unease I felt every time we went there. That night, though, she didn't run to the usual swings by our yard. Instead, she bolted straight for the old playground hidden behind the trees. I didn't want to follow her. My instincts screamed at me to grab her and go back home, but she was already halfway there, her laughter echoing through the empty park. I followed, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I reached the playground, I found Ellie on the swing, her feet dangling, but something was wrong. She wasn't pumping her legs like usual. Instead, the swing was moving on its own, as if someone was pushing her. She was giggling, her head tilted back, eyes looking at something just over my shoulder. "Who's there?" I asked, turning quickly, but there was no one. The playground was empty, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. "She's here," Ellie said with excitement. "She wants you to push her too." My skin crawled. I knew there was no one there, but the swing next to Ellie moved, just a little, just enough for me to notice. "I want to go home," I said, my voice shaking. "But she doesn't want us to leave," Ellie responded, her eyes wide and innocent. I grabbed her off the swing and started walking home, my heart racing. As we left, I could swear I heard the faint sound of a child crying, carried on the wind. When I told my parents, they shrugged it off. "It's just your imagination," they said. That night, Ellie woke up screaming. I rushed to her room, and she was curled up in her bed, her tiny body shaking uncontrollably. "She's mad at me," she sobbed. "She didn't want me to leave." I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop crying. My parents eventually took her to their room, but I couldn't sleep after that. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. And that's when I heard it. The faint, rhythmic creaking of the swing from the playground. But it wasn't windy that night. There was no reason for it to move. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Ellie stopped sleeping. She would talk to the girl in the middle of the night, whispering softly. And when I tried to listen in, I would hear the sound of someone else's voice, too low to make out, but definitely not Ellie's. One day, she disappeared. It was a Saturday. My parents thought she was playing in the backyard, but when they called for her, she didn't answer. I knew exactly where she was. The abandoned playground. I ran there, my heart in my throat, and there she was, sitting on the rusted merry-go-round, motionless, staring at the trees. I called her name, but she didn't respond. When I got closer, I saw her lips moving. She was whispering, but it wasn't her voice. It was that same low, hollow voice I'd heard before. "She says you can't take me home anymore," Ellie said, her voice flat and cold. I grabbed her, shaking her, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she was in, but she just laughed. Not her usual laugh, a guttural, rasping sound that didn't belong in the throat of a 5-year-old. I carried her back home, and that was the last time we ever went near the park. My parents didn't understand, but I couldn't explain. Ellie never talked about the girl again after that, but every night I heard the creak of the swing outside our window, and I knew the girl was still waiting for someone else to come play with her. We moved a few months later. I never went back to that neighborhood, but I've looked it up since. The house at 722 Crestview Avenue is still there, but no one stays for long. People leave. Some say it's haunted, but they never know why. Only I do. And I'll never forget the girl who wanted to play forever. You've probably heard of haunted places before, but have you ever heard of Greyfriars Cemetery in Edinburgh? It's not just another urban legend. People have been attacked, scratched, and even hospitalized after encounters with something that shouldn't exist. The weirdest part, many of these incidents have been documented, real, tangible evidence of something otherworldly, and I can tell you, because I've seen it, felt it. It all started when I decided to visit Edinburgh last fall. I wasn't there for ghost tours or haunted walks, just some solo traveling, exploring history. But Greyfriars? It kept coming up in conversations with locals who mentioned the cemetery like it was some sort of forbidden zone. People go there and they don't come back the same, one guy at a pub muttered. He laughed it off, but his eyes were serious. I didn't believe it at first. I mean, a haunted cemetery sounded like some tourist trap, but being the curious idiot that I am, I decided to check it out. I told myself it was just to take pictures, but deep down I think I wanted to feel that thrill. I wanted to see something no one could explain. When I arrived, Greyfriars looked like any old cemetery, ancient tombstones, iron gates, and the usual chill you'd expect from a place that old. But the minute I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavier, colder, even though it wasn't particularly cold that day. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the typical Scottish weather. The place was quiet, too quiet. You'd expect to hear the distant hum of the city, maybe the chatter of a few tourists, but there was nothing, just silence. And then, almost instinctively, I was drawn toward the Black Mausoleum. They say this is where George Mackenzie, the infamous Bloody Mackenzie, is buried. He was a brutal persecutor of the Scottish Covenanters, and apparently his spirit has never really left. People talk about cold spots and sudden scratches appearing on their skin after approaching his tomb. I thought it was all nonsense. But as I stood there, staring at that cold, blackened stone structure, I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees. I couldn't feel my fingers, and a sudden wave of nausea hit me. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot, like I was being watched. I scanned the area. There was no one around, just old graves and crooked headstones, moss-covered and forgotten by time. Then, the footsteps started. At first they were faint, like someone shuffling through leaves, but they got louder, heavier, like someone in boots was walking straight toward me. My heart was racing, my mind trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was another visitor. Maybe I was just hearing my own footsteps echo back at me. I turned around. No one. My stomach flipped. The footsteps stopped when I stopped, but the feeling of being watched, that was still there, more intense now. I felt it in my bones. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. That's when I felt it, the sharp sting of something scraping across my back. Like nails, cold and jagged, tearing through my jacket. I yelped, spinning around, but again nothing. No one. I could feel blood trickling down my back, the fabric of my shirt sticking to my skin. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't in my head. Something had touched me. I backed away from the mausoleum, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A shadow, tall and hunched, standing just at the edge of the cemetery, where the trees began to thicken. It was watching me. I knew it. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, even though I couldn't see a face. Panicking, I bolted toward the gate. I didn't care about taking pictures anymore. I didn't care about the thrill. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. But as I ran, the footsteps followed, faster this time, matching my pace and getting closer. I swear I could hear breathing raspy, like someone struggling for air right behind me. I didn't stop running until I was out of the cemetery and halfway back to my hotel. I practically collapsed on the bed, drenched in sweat, my back still stinging from the scratches. I ripped off my jacket and shirt, and there they were, 4 deep, red lines trailing down my spine. Real, physical evidence of something I couldn't explain. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear those footsteps again, feel that presence in the room with me. And the nightmares, God, the nightmares. Faces pale, lifeless faces with empty eyes staring at me, whispering my name. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and the strange urge to go back to Greyfriars. I couldn't explain it. It was like something was pulling me back, like unfinished business. I ignored it at first, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous, but the pull only got stronger as the day went on. By sunset, I found myself back at the cemetery gates. Against my better judgment, the air was colder now, the sky overcast and threatening rain. As I stepped inside, the silence hit me again, even heavier than before. It was suffocating. I didn't want to go back to the mausoleum, but my legs moved on their own. As I approached it, I noticed something strange, a figure standing near the tomb. A man dressed in dark, tattered clothes, his head bowed. He didn't move, didn't react to my presence, just stood there like a statue. My throat tightened. I should have left. I should have turned around and left, but I couldn't. I needed to know who he was. Or what he was. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Slowly he lifted his head and I froze. His eyes, if you could call them, that were hollow, sunken pits of darkness. His skin was pale, almost translucent, like he'd been buried for years. And then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place. All I could do was watch as he began to walk toward me. His footsteps the same heavy thuds I'd heard the day before. Closer, closer. I turned and ran, heart slamming against my ribs, lungs burning as I sprinted for the gate. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him, right behind me. Closer, closer. I reached the gate and threw myself through it, collapsing onto the sidewalk outside. When I finally looked up, there was nothing there. No man, no footsteps, just the cold, empty cemetery. I never believed in ghosts. I thought they were just stories, like the ones you hear around a campfire to scare the kids. But what happened to me at Gettysburg? That was real. I still don't understand it, and I don't expect you to believe me. But I need to tell someone. It was last summer. A couple of friends and I decided to take a road trip across Pennsylvania, and naturally we ended up in Gettysburg. It's one of those places you always hear about, the site of the bloodiest battle in the Civil War, where thousands of men died in just 3 days. It sounded like a good historical stop, and honestly I didn't expect much. We weren't ghost hunters, we were just curious. We arrived late in the afternoon, and the place felt heavy. Not like a normal battlefield memorial, where you get a sense of reverence. No, Gettysburg felt wrong, like something was pressing down on us the minute we set foot on the grass. I chalked it up to the history of the place, the sheer volume of death that happened there. But then weird things started happening. It began with small stuff. We were walking along the ridges near Little Round Top when I started to hear a faint drumming sound in the distance. It was strange because no one else seemed to hear it. My friends were talking, laughing, completely oblivious. I told myself it was just the wind, but the drumming continued, rhythmic and steady, like someone was marching toward me. It's the battlefield, I thought. Of course you're going to hear things. Maybe it was just a reenactment somewhere nearby. But as we moved further into the park, the sounds followed us, marching, muffled voices, and something else, like metal clanging against metal. I was getting that feeling you get when someone's watching you, but whenever I turned around, there was no one there. Just the rolling fields, empty except for us, and a few distant tourists. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling. And I wasn't the only one. When we reached Devil's Den, my friend Josh started acting weird. He'd been fine all day, joking around, being his usual self. But now, he just stopped talking. He kept glancing around like he was seeing something none of us could. His face went pale, and he pulled me aside. "Do you see them?" he whispered, his voice shaky. "See who?" I asked, my stomach twisting with unease. "The soldiers. They're right there." I looked in the direction he was pointing, but there was nothing, just rocks and trees. No reenactors, no tourists. Josh, man, there's no one there." He didn't say anything, just stood there staring into the distance. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare. I grabbed his arm and tried to snap him out of it, but he jerked away like I'd burned him. "They're marching," he muttered under his breath. "I can hear them. They're coming this way." At that point, I was seriously freaked out. I thought maybe he was messing with me, trying to pull some prank, but he looked genuinely terrified. And then, out of nowhere, he took off running. Full sprint, straight toward the woods. We chased after him, calling his name, but he wouldn't stop. He was screaming something about them being right behind him. When we finally caught up, he was standing at the edge of a ravine, staring down into the trees below. His chest was heaving, his face drenched in sweat. He didn't say anything, just stared blankly into the distance, as if he was waiting for something or someone. We dragged him back to the car, and he refused to talk the entire drive home. He kept looking out the window like he expected to see something following us. By the time we reached the hotel that night, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my bones. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that drumming again, closer now, almost inside my head. The next morning, Josh was gone. His bed was neatly made, his stuff still in the room, but he wasn't there. We searched the entire hotel, even called the front desk. They said they hadn't seen him leave. His phone was on the nightstand, still charging, but there was no sign of him anywhere. That's when I noticed it. A faint mark on the inside of the door. It looked like a handprint smeared across the wood, almost like it had been burned into the surface. But it wasn't a normal handprint, it was too large, too distorted. I ran my fingers over it, and the wood felt cold, colder than it should have been. We called the police, but there was nothing they could do. No signs of struggle, no evidence he'd left of his own free will. It was like he had just vanished. Well, a few weeks later, I got an email from Josh's account. No subject, no message, just a single image. It was a photo of Devil's Den taken from the exact spot where he had freaked out. But there was something in the photo, something I hadn't seen before. In the background, standing between the rocks, was a figure. It was blurry, shadowed, but unmistakable. A soldier. His uniform was torn, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I tried to show it to my other friends, but when I went back to the email, it was gone. Deleted. No trace of it in my inbox. But I know what I saw. I haven't been back to Gettysburg since, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear that drumming again. It's faint, almost like it's coming from another room, or from someplace far away. But it's there, a steady rhythm, marching closer and closer. And every time I hear it, I wonder, what did Josh see that day? What's still out there, marching through the fields of Gettysburg, long after the battle ended? People say the dead can't hurt you, that ghosts are just figments of our imagination, shadows of the past. But I've seen the truth. The dead at Gettysburg never left. They're still fighting, still marching, and sometimes they take someone with them. It started like most things in small towns do, quietly, almost unnoticed. Taft, California wasn't the kind of place where strange things happened. The most excitement we ever had was a high school football game or the occasional local scandal. But in the summer of 1983, something changed. The town was hit by a wave of terror that no one could explain. And it all started with a phone call. I was 17 at the time, living with my mom and dad in a small one-story house just a few blocks from the high school. We weren't rich, but we got by, and life was normal, if not a bit boring. That's why, when the phone rang in the middle of the night, I thought it was just another prank. Kids used to pull dumb stunts all the time. But this was different. It was 3:53 a.m. when the phone rang, waking me from a deep sleep. I groggily reached for the receiver, not thinking much of it. "Hello?" I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. At first, there was nothing but static on the other end. I was about to hang up when I heard it, a voice, faint and whispery, like someone standing in the shadows of a dark room. "David." I froze. It wasn't just the fact that the voice said my name, it was the way it said it, like a long, drawn-out breath. It was cold, eerie, almost inhuman. I didn't say anything back. I couldn't. I just sat there, heart pounding, gripping the receiver so hard my knuckles turned white. "David," the voice repeated, barely above a whisper. And then, just like that, the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time after that, trying to convince myself it had been some kind of dream. Maybe I was half asleep and imagined the whole thing, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. It had been real. When I mentioned it to my parents the next day, they shrugged it off. "Probably just a wrong number," my dad said, barely looking up from his newspaper. But something in my mom's expression made me think she didn't quite believe that. She looked uneasy, but didn't say anything else. The next night, I stayed up late. I wasn't exactly waiting for the phone to ring, but part of me was tense, like I knew something was coming. Sure enough, at exactly 3:53 a.m., the phone rang again. This time I didn't hesitate. I snatched up the receiver, my pulse already racing. "Who is this?" I demanded. There was a pause, and then the same voice, soft, whispery, and distant, spoke. "They're watching you, David." My blood ran cold. I wanted to slam the phone down, but I couldn't move. It felt like the voice had some kind of hold on me, freezing me in place. "They're watching, always watching." The line went dead again. I dropped the phone like it had burned me, my heart hammering in my chest. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? The following week, things only got worse. The calls kept coming, always at 3:53 a.m., always the same whisper. Sometimes it said my name. Sometimes it muttered things I couldn't quite understand, phrases about watching, about being followed, about things that lurked in the dark. When my parents started noticing something was wrong, my mom would catch me zoning out during dinner, my food untouched. My dad mentioned that I looked pale, tired, like I hadn't slept in days. And I hadn't. But the weirdest part, I wasn't the only one getting these calls. It started to spread around town. Other people, neighbors, friends began complaining about late-night phone calls from an unknown number. The voice was always the same, a soft, haunting whisper that called their names or said something chilling. No one could trace the calls. The phone company claimed the numbers didn't exist, like they were coming from nowhere. One night, after another sleepless evening, I went for a walk to clear my head. It was about 2 a.m., the streets empty and quiet. I passed by the old corner store on Baker Street, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just some guy standing at the corner. He had his back to me, a phone held up to his ear, but he was completely still. Too still. I slowed down, squinting to see him more clearly in the dim light of the street lamp. Something about the way he stood there felt wrong, unnatural. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly uneasy. "Hey," I called out, hoping for some kind of response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. He just kept holding the phone to his ear, facing the darkness. My stomach knotted with dread, but I forced myself to walk closer. I don't know why I did it, maybe some morbid curiosity or some part of me that needed to prove this was all in my head. But the closer I got, the more I realized something wasn't right. His clothes looked strange, out of place, like they were from another time. His body was rigid, his posture unnervingly stiff. And then, as I took one more step forward, he vanished. Just like that. 1 second he was there, the next, gone. I stood there, my heart in my throat, staring at the empty spot where he'd been. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the lack of sleep and the calls were messing with my head. Or maybe something much worse was happening. I didn't go for late-night walks after that. The next morning, I overheard my mom on the phone with a neighbor. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard her say, "He saw someone too, right there on the corner." I froze. After she hung up, I confronted her about it. She looked hesitant at first, but finally admitted that other people in town had started seeing the same thing, a man standing on various street corners holding a phone. He never moved, never spoke. And every time someone tried to approach him, he vanished. That's when the disappearances started. At first, it was just small things, people claiming they'd lost track of time, waking up in strange places with no memory of how they got there. But soon, people began to disappear entirely. One by one, those who had been receiving the phone calls just vanished. Their houses were left unlocked, their cars still in the driveway. No signs of struggle, no clues. They were just gone. I wish I could tell you the police took it seriously, but they didn't. In a small town like Taft, things like this weren't supposed to happen. The local sheriff wrote it off as people leaving town without telling anyone, or maybe a string of unrelated incidents. But those of us who had heard the voice, seen the man on the corner, we knew better. It's been years since then. I'm one of the few left from that time who can still tell the story. Most people who lived through it either moved away or disappeared. The calls stopped eventually, at least for me. I moved out of Taft the second I could. And for a while, I thought I'd escaped it. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of a phone ringing in the back of my mind. And every time I check the clock, it's always 3:53. There are some things you can't outrun. You ever have one of those nights where everything feels off from the start? That's how it was for us. The four of us, me, Matt, Sarah, and Erica, had decided to take a weekend road trip to break free from the monotony of our day-to-day lives. We'd planned to hit some small towns, do a little sightseeing, maybe camp for a night. We weren't going too far, just a few hours out from the city, but it felt like a world away. That evening, we were driving through the middle of nowhere. I don't even know what state we were in anymore. There were no streetlights, no other cars on the road, just us, and the black ribbon of highway stretching into the dark. Matt was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and Sarah and Erica were dozing in the back. It was around 1 a.m. when Matt started complaining that he needed to pee. We hadn't seen a gas station or rest stop in what felt like hours, so when we saw a sign for a rest area up ahead, it felt like a small victory. "Thank God," Matt muttered, rubbing his eyes. We all needed a break. The sign said rest stop, 2 miles with a faded, peeling arrow pointing off the main road. I don't remember seeing the name of the town it was supposed to be near, but I figured it didn't matter. All we needed was a bathroom and maybe a vending machine. When Matt took the exit, the road leading to the rest stop was narrow, barely 2 lanes, and lined with thick woods on both sides. There were no lights anywhere, and I kept thinking how strange it was that this place was so isolated. Most rest stops have at least a few lights, maybe a security camera or 2, but this one was dead silent and pitch black. A minute later, we pulled into a small parking lot. The rest stop building was an old, run-down structure, barely visible in the dim light of the car's headlights. No other cars, no signs of life. Just us and that decrepit little building. "You sure this place is still open?" Sarah asked from the back seat, her voice thick with sleep. "I don't know, but I'm about to explode," Matt replied, already climbing out of the car. I followed him out, glancing around. There was something off about the place. It wasn't just the fact that it looked abandoned, it was the stillness. No wind, no rustling in the trees, nothing. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The building was small, just a single room with a couple of bathrooms attached. The door creaked when Matt pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic, like rust or old blood. I shuddered, but Matt didn't seem to notice. He just headed straight for the men's room. While Matt was inside, I stood outside the car, looking around. Sarah and Erica had gotten out too, stretching and yawning. Erica wandered off a little, heading toward the edge of the lot where the forest started. "You shouldn't go too far," I called out to her, trying to sound casual, but inside, my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. She didn't respond, just kept walking, disappearing into the shadows. "Erica," I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Relax, she's probably just stretching her legs," Sarah said, but she sounded unsure, her eyes flicking nervously toward the dark trees. I don't know what made me follow Erica. Maybe it was the unease that had been building in my chest since we got off the highway, or maybe it was just instinct. Either way, I found myself walking after her, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but it only made the shadows seem deeper. I called her name again, my voice shaky now. "Erica, come on, this isn't funny." And then I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling as I scanned the edge of the forest. The trees loomed like black sentinels, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving between them. Something tall, too tall to be Erica. I backed away, my heart pounding, and almost bumped into Matt, who had just come out of the building. "Where's Erica?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. I don't know." She wandered off. We called her name together, but there was no answer. The silence of the forest swallowed our voices. The air had grown colder, and that strange feeling of being watched crept over me again. I could feel it, something just beyond the reach of our flashlight, hiding in the woods, watching us. Then, Sarah screamed. I whipped around to see her standing by the car, staring at something on the ground. We ran over, and when we saw what she was looking at, my blood turned to ice. It was a footprint. A huge, deep footprint, like something heavy had pressed into the soft earth. It wasn't human, too long, too wide, and the shape was wrong. It looked almost like a hand with long, thin fingers digging into the dirt. "What the hell is that?" Matt whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard another sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us. It vibrated through the ground, through my bones, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Whatever it was big, and it was close. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Matt nodded, but just as we turned to run back to the car, Erica stepped out of the woods, her face pale and blank, her eyes wide but unseeing. "Erica." I ran to her, relief flooding through me until I saw her hands. They were covered in dirt and something dark, something wet. "Erica, what happened?" I grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to get her to look at me, but she just stared past me toward the trees. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's watching us." We didn't waste any time. Matt threw open the car doors and we piled in, slamming them shut like we thought it might keep whatever was out there from getting to us. Erica was still in some sort of daze, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the seatbelt. I don't think any of us knew what was happening, but we knew one thing for sure. We weren't staying to find out. Matt floored it, and the car shot forward, gravel spitting up behind us as we sped down the narrow road back to the highway. The The whole time, none of us said a word. The only sound was the engine roaring and our ragged breathing. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us, something monstrous bursting out of the trees, but the road behind us was empty, just darkness. After a few minutes, Matt finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice just as unsteady. "But something's wrong with Erica." We all looked at her. She was sitting in the back seat, staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unfocused. Her hands were still trembling, and that strange dark substance was smeared all over them. I didn't want to think about what it could be. "Erica," I said softly, trying to get through to her. "What happened out there?" She blinked, like she was coming out of a fog, and turned to look at me. Her eyes were full of fear. I don't remember. I heard something in the woods, and then everything went black. I felt something, touching me, watching me. "Watching you?" Matt asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "It's still watching us." We all fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over us like a heavy blanket. I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to convince myself that it was just some kind of prank, that maybe we were all just tired and paranoid, but deep down I knew she was right. Something had been watching us, and it wasn't gone. I pulled out my phone, desperate to get a signal, to find our location on the map, but of course we were still in the middle of nowhere, and still at where? When it's still in the middle of nowhere, and there was no service. I tried to remember the name of the road we had taken, but nothing was coming to mind. It was like the whole rest stop didn't exist. "Where the hell are we?" I muttered, frustration boiling over. "This road isn't even showing up on the GPS." Matt glanced over at me, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What do you mean it's not showing up?" "I mean it's not on the map," I snapped, shaking the phone at him. "There's nothing here. No road, no rest stop, nothing." For the first time, Matt looked genuinely scared. "That's impossible. We took the exit, right? We saw the sign." "Yeah, we saw the sign," I said, my voice growing more frantic. "But where's the rest of it? There's no town, no highway markers, nothing. It's like we're driving through a dead zone." And that's when it hit me. What if that rest stop, what if it wasn't supposed to be there? Matt shot me a confused look. "What the hell are you talking about? What if we took a wrong turn somewhere? What if that place doesn't exist on any map because it's not supposed to? Like it's, I don't know, some kind of trap?" Sarah let out a small, strangled laugh. "You're saying we stumbled onto some kind of ghost rest stop? That doesn't make any sense." I wanted to agree with her. I wanted to believe that this was all just some weird coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to find that place, and now, whatever was there, it had followed us. The road stretched on, twisting and turning through the woods, and no matter how far we drove, there was no sign of civilization. No gas stations, no towns, nothing, just trees and shadows. And then, without warning, the car started to slow down. "What's happening?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. Matt cursed under his breath, slamming his foot on the gas pedal, but the car barely responded. "I don't know. The engine's losing power." We all looked at each other, fear settling in like a weight. There was no way we were running out of gas. We had filled up just before we left, and we hadn't been driving long enough to burn through a tank. "It's not the gas," Matt muttered, shaking his head. "Something's wrong with the engine." The car sputtered, slowing to a crawl, and then just like that it died. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving us in total darkness. "Shit," Matt whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What do we do now?" We sat there in the dark, the silence thick and suffocating. The air in the car felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. And then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it again. That growl. Low, guttural, and closer this time. "It's still here," Erica whispered, her voice trembling. "It's coming for us." Panic surged through me, and I reached for the door handle. "We need to get out of here. We can't just sit here and wait for whatever that thing is too." But before I could finish, something slammed into the side of the car, hard enough to make the whole vehicle rock. We all screamed, huddling together in the center of the car, our eyes wide with terror. Another hit, this time on the roof. Whatever was out there, it was huge. It was circling us, testing the car, like a predator stalking its prey. "We can't stay in here," Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. "We have to run." I didn't have time to argue. We grabbed our bags and threw open the doors, bolting out into the night, our feet pounding against the dirt as we sprinted toward the trees. Behind us, I could hear the thing, whatever it was, crashing through the woods, chasing us. My heart was in my throat, my lungs burning as I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. But no matter how fast we ran, it was getting closer. And that's when I realized we were never going to outrun it. It had been waiting for us, and now it was closing in. It was one of those weekends that seemed perfect for camping. You know, the type that feels like a reset after months of stress. My friends and I had planned it out for weeks, a simple getaway to a spot we'd heard about near the national forest, somewhere remote, off the main road, with no Wi-Fi and no obligations. Just the kind of peaceful isolation we all craved. There were 4 of us, me, Ryan, Jake, and Vanessa. We were close, had been since college, and trips like this were our thing. A couple of tents, a fire, some beers, and we were good to go. The drive was long, and the further we got from civilization, the more relaxed we became. The trees started getting thicker, the radio cut out, and our phones lost signal. Exactly what we wanted. We found a clearing just off the main highway, down a gravel road that looked more like a logging trail. It wasn't an official campsite, no fire rings or picnic tables, but we weren't picky. The spot had plenty of space, a clear view of the stars, and no one around for miles. It was perfect. After setting up camp, we were hanging out by the fire when I noticed something through the trees. A van, parked maybe 50 yards away, partially hidden in the brush. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. People camp all the time in their cars or vans, but something about this one felt off. "Hey, did you guys see that?" I asked, pointing toward the van. Ryan squinted in the direction I was pointing. "Yeah, probably just someone else camping. No biggie." But it was a biggie. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with it. The van was old, beat up, and covered in grime as if it had been sitting there for months, maybe longer. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. It was too quiet around it, too still. "We should go check it out," Vanessa suggested, half joking. I laughed it off, but deep down I agreed with her. My curiosity was gnawing at me. Eventually, after a few more beers and some good-natured ribbing, we decided to take a look. Why not, right? What's the worst that could happen? We grabbed a couple of flashlights and made our way toward the van, our feet crunching on the fallen leaves. The closer we got, the more unsettling the whole situation felt. The van was in worse shape than I'd realized. Rust covered the body, and the tires were completely flat, deflated like they'd been abandoned for years. There was no license plate. Ryan stepped forward and tried the handle. Locked. "I guess no one's home," he said, turning to us with a grin. But as we stood there, staring at the van, a chill ran through me. I wasn't sure if it was the cool night air or something else, but suddenly, I didn't want to be there anymore. "We should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake laughed. "What, are you scared? It's just a crappy old van." But I wasn't the only one who felt it. Vanessa had gone quiet too, her eyes fixed on the van like she was expecting something to happen. Ryan shrugged and started to walk away, but before he could take more than a few steps, Vanessa grabbed his arm. Wait, she said. "Look." She pointed to the side of the van, where the moonlight caught something scratched into the metal. At first, it looked like random markings, but as I got closer, I could make out words, dozens of them, all scrawled messily across the side of the van. Some were legible, others were too faded or obscured by rust, but the ones I could read made my blood run cold. "Don't trust IT. IT's you. We're still inside." We stood there, staring at the messages in stunned silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a prank? Had someone messed with this van as a joke? Well, there was something so desperate, so raw about the way the words were scratched in. Whoever had written them had done it in a hurry, like they were trying to warn anyone who might stumble upon this place. Vanessa was the first to break the silence. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. None of us argued. We made our way back to the campsite, and the whole atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, and the fire that had once been warm and inviting now seemed small and weak. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the trees. Back at the fire, we tried to shake it off. Jake cracked a few jokes to lighten the mood, but none of us were really laughing. That van had unnerved us all, and no one wanted to admit it. As the night went on, the uneasiness grew. Every little sound in the woods made my heart race. A branch snapping, the wind rustling through the trees, it all felt too loud, too close. I could tell the others felt it too. Vanessa kept glancing at the van, even though it was out of sight, hidden by the trees. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words scratched into the van's side. "Don't trust IT. IT sees you. We're still inside." At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is waking up to a noise outside my tent. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. For a few moments there was nothing, just the wind, the crackle of the dying fire, and the steady breathing of my friends in their tents. Then I heard it again, louder this time, closer. It was coming from the direction of the van. Juan. I sat up, my pulse racing, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the campsite. Everything looked normal except for the van. It was closer. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but as I stared at it, I realized the van had moved. It was now just beyond the edge of our campsite, half hidden in the trees. I froze, not sure what to do. Had someone moved it? Was there someone inside? And then I saw it. A faint light flickering inside the van, barely visible through the grimy windows. Someone was inside. Part 2. We're still inside. My stomach twisted in knots as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The van had been parked far away when we first saw it, and there was no way it could have moved closer on its own. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone else was out here, maybe a prankster messing with us. But the flickering light inside made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't a bright, comforting light like a lantern or flashlight. It was weak and erratic, like an old, malfunctioning bulb that struggled to stay on. I couldn't stay silent. I had to wake the others. Ryan, I hissed, crawling over to his tent. Jake, Vanessa. Ryan stirred, mumbling something groggy. What's up? The van, I whispered urgently. It moved. He blinked at me, still half asleep. What are you talking about? I'm serious, man. It's right there, righted. I pointed toward the van, now ominously close to our campfire. Ryan sat up, rubbing his eyes. When he saw the van, his face went pale. What the hell? By this point, Vanessa and Jake had woken up too, and we all gathered outside our tents, staring at the van in disbelief. Did someone move it? Jake asked, his voice trembling. No, I said. I don't think anyone touched it. We stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. The light inside the van flickered again, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. Someone or something was inside. I think we should leave, Vanessa whispered. Her voice was shaking, but I could tell she was serious. None of us argued. We quickly packed up our gear, trying to move as quietly as possible. Every minute felt like an eternity as we hastily shoved our belongings into bags, our eyes darting between each other and the van. But as we were about to leave, Jake froze. Wait, he said, his eyes wide. Do you hear that? We all stopped and listened. At first I couldn't hear anything beyond the sound of the wind, but then I heard it too. A faint tapping coming from the van. It was rhythmic, like someone lightly tapping their fingers on the inside of the van's windows. We backed away slowly, unsure of what to do. My brain was screaming at me to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity? Fear? I wasn't sure, but I knew we shouldn't be standing there. Suddenly the tapping stopped. The van went completely dark. Then, from the direction of the van, a voice called out. Help us. Us. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, trembling and weak, as if she hadn't spoken in days. We all froze. Did you hear that? Vanessa whispered, her face pale. Before anyone could answer, the voice came again, louder this time. Help us, please. Jake took a step forward, as if he were about to approach the van, but I grabbed his arm. No, we're leaving, now. But what if someone's inside? What if they're hurt? Jake protested. I didn't care. Everything about this felt wrong. The van, the scratches on the side, the way it had moved, none of it made any sense. And that voice, there was something off about it, something that didn't sit right with me. We need to go, I said firmly, my voice shaking. Reluctantly, the others agreed. We turned our backs on the van and hurried toward the car, our hearts pounding in our chests. But just as we reached the edge of the clearing, the voice came again, this time louder than ever. We're still inside. I whipped around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, landing on the van. The windows were still dark, and the light inside had flickered out. But now, in the dim moonlight, I could see something moving behind the grimy glass. Shadows. Figures. They were pressing against the windows, their hands smearing the glass, desperate, clawing to get out. And then, just as quickly as I saw them, they disappeared. Ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. We piled in, and I floored it, speeding down the gravel road, not daring to look back. The whole ride home was a blur. No one said a word. We didn't need to. We were all thinking the same thing. What the hell had just happened? It wasn't until we were miles away, back on the highway, that Ryan finally broke the silence. "Do you think they were real?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was inside that van, they weren't alive anymore. And as we drove further and further away, I could still hear the voice in my head echoing over and over again. "We're still inside." Had you ever heard of the black community in Virginia? My editor's voice still echoes in my head as I pull up to the quiet, desolate town of Millbridge. It was one of those assignments you didn't really want to take, but couldn't turn down either. What intrigued me the most was how little information existed about this place. My search yielded almost nothing: no news articles, no significant historical records, nothing except whispers about a black community hidden deep in the woods, rumors not facts. When I arrived, the village was everything you'd expect from a forgotten rural area. Wooden houses, cracked sidewalks, and people who looked like they hadn't seen a stranger in years. As soon as I mentioned my interest in old religious communities, the mood shifted. I could see it in their eyes. They were holding something back. It was when I asked about the black community that a local shopkeeper froze. His hand trembled as he handed me my change. "Stay out of the northern woods," he muttered, not looking me in the eye. "You don't want to end up like the others." That was my first warning. I should have left right then. But I didn't. My editor's research had led me here for one purpose: to investigate the recent disappearances. At least 6 people had gone missing over the past year, all of them last seen in or around Millbridge. No bodies were found, and the local sheriff's office claimed they were probably runaways or drifters. But something didn't add up. Why was everyone so tight-lipped? Why did the town's records have gaps in them dating back decades? I rented a room at the only motel in town. It was a dingy place with peeling wallpaper and a bed that creaked every time I so much as blinked. I set up my laptop and started combing through the sparse data I had. By the time night fell, an unsettling calm had taken over the town. I decided to drive out toward the northern woods the next morning. The next morning, as I packed my camera and notebook into my car, I noticed something strange. My glove compartment was open. I always kept it locked. Inside, everything seemed untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been there. Was it just paranoia? I started the engine, but it sputtered, coughed, and died. A chill ran down my spine. My car, which had worked perfectly fine the day before, now refused to start. I checked the gas full, the battery fine. I hadn't noticed anyone tampering with it, yet something was wrong. I glanced around, but the streets were deserted. I called the local mechanic. He arrived half an hour later, shrugging as he checked the engine. "Everything seems in order," he said. "Must have been a fluke. Try starting it now." The car roared to life, but the unease didn't leave me. Determined not to let this setback stop me, I decided to walk to the northern woods. As I approached the area, the trees grew denser, the light dimmer. That's when I saw them for the first time: people in black robes, standing still among the trees. I tried to snap a photo, but they were gone before my camera could focus. Later that evening, back in my motel room, I noticed something even more disturbing. My suitcase had been opened. My clothes, my notes, they were all there, but something was off. It was like someone had gone through them, but carefully. No signs of a break-in, no scratches on the door. Just that creeping feeling that someone had been inside. I locked the door, triple-checked the windows, but sleep didn't come easy. At 3 a.m. I woke to a soft sound. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening as they grew louder, closer, stopping right outside my door. And then silence. I wanted to get up, to check the peephole, but fear pinned me to the bed. In the morning I found a small black mark etched into the motel room door. A symbol, unrecognizable but ominous. I had had enough. I packed my bags and prepared to leave Millbridge for good, but as I approached my car, I froze. A group of figures stood on the far side of the parking lot, dressed in black cloaks, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They weren't moving, just standing there staring. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. The car refused to start. Panic surged through me. I jumped out and ran back into the motel, locking the door behind me. My heart raced as I paced the room, trying to figure out my next move. Every time I glanced outside, they were still there, closer now, just standing. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and approached the door. The knocking stopped, replaced by heavy breathing. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. That night I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, the figures were gone, but I wasn't alone. My belongings had been ransacked again. This time my laptop was gone, along with my notes. I knew then that leaving wasn't an option. Whatever this black community was, they weren't going to let me go. My phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. "You've seen too much. Don't try to run." The final straw came when I saw the same black symbol etched into my car door. They were marking me, following me, and I had no idea how to escape. Every attempt to call for help was met with static. The town was isolating me, trapping me in its dark web of secrets. I stood there, next to the car, my breath hitching, my heart pounding in my chest. Black figures surrounded me, and I didn't know where to run. Their faces were hidden, but their silence became unbearable. They didn't move, but I knew this was the end. I stepped back, but they kept looking, slowly and methodically. At one point, one of them came up tight, his hood almost touching my skin. Before I could realize what was happening, his hand grabbed my wrist. A sharp pain pierced my arm as if hot metal had burned through my flesh. I screamed, but the sounds were gone, as if there was no air or sound around me. The figures stared at me silently, and one of them leaned over slowly, whispering something in my ear, but I couldn't hear the words. Suddenly, the world around me changed in the darkness. The last thing I remember were the silent faces and the feeling of terror that filled every cell in my body. I woke up on the cold ground, lying beside the car. For the first few seconds, it felt like I couldn't move. My body felt foreign. My head throbbed with pain, and my wrist stung so badly I wanted to scream. I pulled myself up, took a gulp of fresh air, and looked at my arm. Where the black figure had touched me, there was a mark, a strange symbol burned right into my skin, dark and dangerous. I didn't know what it meant, but a deep fear gripped me. I didn't waste any more time. My mind was racing, the mark burning on my skin like a cursed stigma. The fear was unwavering, and their presence, those figures in black, was closer now. I could feel them. Even though I was back in my motel room, the air seemed thicker, as if something dark and sinister was watching, waiting for me to slip away. This time I wasn't going to wait for them to come to me. I shoved what little I had left in my bag and sprinted out the door, clutching my car keys so tightly they dug into my palm. The plan was simple: get out of Millbridge, drive as far away as possible, and never look back. The motel parking lot was eerily quiet, not a single sound except for my pounding heart. The figures that had been there last night were gone. I ran to my car, my heart pounding. I almost broke the key in my haste to start the engine. The car coughed once, twice, and stalled. I pounded my fists on the steering wheel. Not again. Please, not now. Sweat streamed down my face as I tried again. The car roared to life, coming to life on the third try. Relief came over me until I looked up. At the edge of the parking lot, barely discernible in the dim pre-dawn light, they stood, figures in black robes, closer than before. Their faces were still hidden, but I saw them turn their heads in unison, watching me. My heart sank. There was no mistake, they were here for me. I stepped on the gas, tires squealing as I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were gone, or at least I thought they were gone, but the road seemed too empty. I was moving too fast, too frantically, for it to be this calm. The trees blurred as I drove along the winding roads leading out of town, headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that had settled in. Every corner I turned seemed wrong, as if the road itself was closing in on me, as if I could never get out. And then it hit me. I'd been driving for almost half an hour, but the landmarks, they were familiar. The sign for Millbridge reappeared on the side of the road. I went back to where I'd started. No, this can't be happening, I whispered to myself, panic boiling in my chest. I turned down the next street, determined to find another way out, but every turn brought me back to the village. It was like the city was pulling me back, refusing to let me go. That's when I saw them. At the corner of the street, just beyond the headlights, a group of figures in robes appeared, blocking the road. Their stillness, the sheer menace in their presence, made my blood freeze in my veins. I applied the brakes sharply, slowing down, but they didn't move. There was no haste in their actions, just a slow, deliberate turning of their heads in my direction. They weren't just blocking my path, they were waiting for me. I turned the car around in blind panic, only to discover more of them. They were everywhere now, appearing in every direction, converging like wolves around prey. My hands shook violently on the steering wheel as I tried to back up, but they moved faster. I could hear their footsteps, quiet at first, then louder, getting closer. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as I raced toward the outskirts of town again, praying that this time would be different, but something wasn't. I could feel the car slowing down. Even though I didn't let off the gas pedal, it was as if the road itself was fighting me, dragging me backwards. No matter how fast you run, you can't outrun the darkness. I heard a voice, clear as day, though there was no one in the car with me. My vision blurred as I fought the growing panic. The trees along the road seemed to sway unnaturally, their branches reaching out as if they wanted to grab the car and pull me off the road. I swerved to avoid a collision, my knuckles turning white from the steering wheel. Then, straight ahead, the road branched off. On the left, I could see the road back to Millbridge. On the right, the road dived into dense forests. I had no choice. I turned right, diving into the unknown. The forest was darker than I remembered, the headlights barely illuminating the narrow, winding road. The trees seemed to be pressing in from all sides, as if they were trying to swallow me whole. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 4:13 in the morning. I'd been driving for hours, but it felt like time itself had stopped. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the car. Something hit the roof hard. I hit the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. There was silence for a moment, and then there was a slow, measured scratching sound, like nails scratching metal. My breath caught when I looked up, but the roof was intact. The sound had stopped. Then knock, knock, knock. Now it was coming from the window. Something or someone was standing right beside the car. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. When I turned my head, my stomach dropped. One of the figures in a robe was standing just outside the driver's window, her face hidden under the hood. She slowly raised her hand and pressed it against the glass. My body froze in place as the figure leaned closer. Without thinking, I pressed the gas pedal in again. The car lurched forward, throwing the figure into the shadows. But no matter how fast I drove, the feeling of dread wouldn't let go. Every shadow seemed to be moving, every corner hiding the figure in black. They were everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. Finally, the road straightened out, and through the trees I saw the faint glow of a highway in the distance. This is it, I thought. If I could only get to the highway, I would be safe. But as I broke through the tree line, I saw them. A row of figures in black robes stretched across the road, motionless, their faces hidden by hoods. They were waiting for me, standing like sentries, blocking my only escape route. The car stalled and stopped. There was nowhere to run. When I climbed out of the car, my legs shaking, my breathing ragged, the figures didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared. Slowly, one by one, they began to raise their hands, pointing at me. The air grew colder, and my vision began to blur. My head spun, and I jerked back. And then, nothing. I woke up hours later, lying on the side of the road, my car still parked nearby. The figures in robes were gone, but the fear remained. I trudged back to my car, barely able to comprehend what had happened. I managed to get to the highway and drive far, far away from Millbridge. But no matter how far I drove, I can still feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I don't know why they let me go, or if they let me go at all. But the black mark on my skin, it's still there. And every night I see them in my dreams, standing there, watching, waiting for me to come back.